Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. The rise of Trump is, in many ways, a story about status. Plenty of Americans feel like their relative status has fallen in recent decades, and they believe Trump, both as an embodiment of their identity and values and as a wielder of vast power, can give them that status back. That's the argument my guest made in a recent essay at The Bulwark called Trump's Secret Weapon Has Always Been Status Anxiety. Alan Elrod is president and CEO of the Pulaski Institution and columnist at ARC Digital. We explore how status is perceived, the role of attention in shaping political narratives, and the generational shifts in attitudes towards status and authenticity. We discuss the exhaustion of political engagement, the importance of civic connection, and the challenges posed by online interactions in fostering a civil society. Ultimately, this is a conversation highlighting the need for community engagement and the restoration of social capital in addressing the current political climate. If you enjoy Reimagining Liberty, I encourage you to check out my companion newsletter, where I write about the kinds of ideas we discuss on the show. You can find it on my website at www.aaronrosspowell.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Alan. It has been a troubling and whirlwind now 2 weeks as we're recording this since Trump took office. A lot of things happening that you and I are not fans of, a lot of dangerous things about the future of the country. And so there are important conversations to be had about what to do now, but there are also important conversations to be had about how we got here that then inform how we get out. So maybe I'll start by asking, is everything that's happening right now the result of the price of eggs?
Man, I mean, no. But, when people say this, I always think that there's probably like a marginal effect in which, sure, maybe it is, right? If it was a tiny little bit of people in a number of states who were like really stressed out about their grocery prices, and that's all it took. But we don't really mean that, right? We mean like, why is Trump still popular? Or why is he still got something like a 50% approval rating? Why did we put this guy back in office after an insurrection? Yeah, then no. And to me, the big distinction is that economic anxiety it's not, the argument I make in this piece and the argument I try to make to people isn't that economic anxiety doesn't exist. It's that it's just a component of this bigger thing that is status anxiety. And that has a lot more to do not just with your wealth and your economic power, but with your social power and your sense of how you relate to other people within a society. Are you losing prestige? Are you gaining prestige? Are you being accepted? Are the things that you care about important? Because, right, if society says the things that you care about aren't important, then that also is a sense of status loss because it's saying implicitly, right, that your values are not sort of part of the core values of a society. And so I think the long answer is that, right? The short answer is no, economic anxiety isn't how we got here. The long answer is that economic anxiety can be part of it if we understand it as part of status anxiety.
You said something interesting that I want to dig into because I think it might clarify what we mean by status. Because we often, we talk about status, we talk about it as status is relative. It's not absolute. And so if my status is going to rise, it is because it is now higher than other people's status that it wasn't higher than before. And so their status is lower. So status is always a game of comparisons. But you mentioned there are kind of multiple vectors of status. So there's wealth, there's power, but also there is acceptance of you. There's also acceptance of the kinds of things that you are into. And it struck me as you're saying this, that this kind of decouples status in a way that is particularly interesting. Because what it says, I think a lot of the times when we think about status, we think about it in terms of power terms, that someone who is high status they individually, that person specifically has a degree of power and prestige. And that can come with, like, so if you're very, very wealthy, or you're a celebrity, or you have political power, and that's like an individualized account of status. You, Alan, your status is higher than mine. But the other thing that you said, which stood out to me, is status can be also about the kind of person or position in society or culture that you imagine yourself to be. And so you can be, for lack of a better term, a nobody, in the sense that you don't have wealth, you don't have power, you don't have a large social media following and so on, but you see yourself as a certain kind of person, and you see the kinds of people like that, white Christian evangelicals, or progressives, or urban artists, or whatever it happens to be, whatever category you drop yourself into, you see that as having a status. And if that's the case, it might speak to, like, one of the odd things that we see is people voting for Trump, because we see it as like they're voting for Trump because they want to raise their status. But then we're like, but Trump doesn't really care about you in particular. And you're not necessarily better off. But that's almost, it sounds like you're saying, like, to a certain extent, that's not the point. It's that people like you are seen as are being more centered than people who aren't like you.
Yes. I mean, so, like, a lot of what I think about in this piece is the idea that status it's individual, right? But it's also intergroup. And so when you're thinking of your position as part of a group, that's where you do. I mean, look, that's like what the war on Christmas is, right? Is a big group status conversation, because people aren't saying Merry Christmas as much. Now, a lot of it is fluffed by, media bits that are just nonsense. But the reason some people feel that way, right, is this idea that the group I belong to, maybe it's all Christianity, maybe it's, light Protestant Christianity. Well, we're not as dominant as we used to be, and you can tell because people don't cater and people don't instinctively just abide by the sort of strictures of how we do things anymore, right? They don't. I think it's not true, right? People don't throw you out of the store if you say Merry Christmas, right? They're going to kick you out of Target if you say Merry Christmas to your checkout clerk. But there are little ways in which a person might go, I can tell that my group no longer holds the same position that it did. And sometimes that relative loss of position is just that other people have become kind of equal with you, right? Christianity is not really looked down on. I don't think that's really true at a broad level. What is true is that we've decided that other groups should be thought about more. And that still means, because status is relative, right? It's not, like you said, in like I put in the piece, it's not like economic security, where it's like, if you can pay your bills, that's a certain threshold of economic security. If you can pay your bills and go on vacation, that's another threshold. And they have very kind of clear lines, right? This is what financial well-being looks like. Status doesn't have that. Because what if the guy next to you gets to go to the Bahamas and you can only afford to go to Gulf Shores?
This almost speaks to one of the changes from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration that people talked about was like, we don't have to, it's nice to not have to pay attention to the president anymore. That it was exhausting to have the president be centered in the news like every moment of every day. And now we finally have a boring president who we don't have to think about, and we can think about other things. And I think that was true to a great extent during those 4 years. And we can already, in the couple of weeks of the second Trump administration, see like, oh, things are being centered, or maybe Musk is at the center now versus Trump. But like, people are paying attention to the president again. But that's actually, for a certain kind of person, that just is a sign that Trump is higher status. And that what Trump represents is higher status because everybody's paying attention to it in a way that they weren't paying attention to Biden, who had just as much power by nature of holding the same office.
Yeah, I think that's like an attention economy kind of question, right? And I think that's like something that Chris Hayes has this new book about how everything is kind of the attention economy now. And I think that's probably true. I think that it's also a sort of way of thinking that's behind how we think about status when it comes to our phones and like social media, right? We want attention. And so attention, more followers, people talking about you, right? And this is something I think is where our tendencies towards status concerns and anxieties have been supercharged in the last like decade and a half, right? Because in the past, the only people who could ever get that much attention were famous people. Right. You had to be somebody who could end up in a tabloid. You had to be Jennifer Aniston, and you had to be the president. But now we have these extremely fragmented kind of markets, but also these devices where anyone can get famous, but also where the sort of attention that gets applied to people has shifted a little bit. And so now people can sit on their phones and think about the president as a stand-in, right? He has high status for himself, or also just themselves, or the kind of media they like, or their accounts, their favorite people, and all these sorts of things that are or aren't getting the attention they'd like. I'm not getting the likes I want. I'm not getting the views I want. I'm not living the life, I'm not living the life I see other people living on these places. I think the attention economy aspect is a really interesting, as you said, factor to status concerns. Both because it's true, like we value attention. It's clearly a commodity in this particular 21st century economy. But also because we completely rewrote the book. And I mentioned a little bit in the piece the idea of meritocracy when it comes to democracy, redefining who gets to rule and who has power, but that also implies that there's a sort of perpetual contest for power. Well, the way that social media and our devices rewrote the attention economy does the same thing, right? Because now anyone can compete for that level of status and attention and fame. And also anyone can kind of feel pissed off that they're not getting it, right? In the 90s, you wouldn't be mad necessarily or chagrined that no one, I guess unless you were an aspiring actor, that no one knew you the way they know, who, again, Jennifer Aniston or Jerry Seinfeld is. But now you can kind of feel that way because there are these ways that people can obtain this status and this position. And if they're successful at it, they get to reap the benefits. And if you're out there and you're one of the many, 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 many more people, right, who are just on social media and not receiving that, you can feel a little mad that actually like it's not going the way that it's going for them, for you.
That's a fascinating point that I think might shift how we think about some interesting issues in particularly interesting ways. And so there is this, like, what's different about current generations and the status games that they play. And I don't think it's the case that like people have become more status seeking than they used to be, or they care more about status than they used to be, because humans have been obsessed with status for as long as we've been around, and history is full of stories of this. But that quantification of it and access to it has enabled people to feel like they can achieve high status in a way that they were resigned to not achieving it before, and to measure it. And I was thinking as you were saying this, one of the things that I have noticed is, so I am Gen X, and Gen X, when I was a teenager, like the worst possible thing anyone could do was sell out, right? And like if you listened to the band and they were on an indie label and they signed with a major label, it was like, they're just dead to me. They've sold out. And what you were upset with is they have become popular, right? Like there's something wrong with having become popular, because to become popular is to become inauthentic, because that's the only way you can achieve mass acceptance, so on and so forth. Selling out was bad. But for younger generations, and particularly the generations that grew up entirely in these digital space, in a social media world, it seems like selling out is the goal for a lot of them. Like that's what they dream of. All the kids want to become YouTube celebrities or TikTok celebrities. You want to sell out. This is kind of like the grind mindset fits into this. The kind of LinkedIn influencer culture fits into this. And it occurred to me while you were saying this that the difference is not that teenagers when I was a teenager are less concerned with status than teenagers today or young adults, but that we knew that, except in the case of becoming a famous actor or famous athlete or whatever, you couldn't break through to the status that came with fame. And so you weren't, it was like you had this very clear indicator of, yes, that would be nice, but I'm not going to chase it because I know I can't get it. And then I'm going to kind of look down my nose at people who are chasing it. Versus now where you can chase it, you can see people who are achieving it, and they're just randos like you who just struck it lucky. And you can quantify it exactly. You can say, here, I can tell you exactly how. Here is a number that says how famous and how much status this person has. And I can see my number going up.
From YouTube, right?
Yes, exactly.
For the level of like subscribers you get. And if someone has like that special like platinum one, right? That's like really cool.
Yes.
No, I had this interaction. I wish I would do it. The segment was short, but I remember, I wrote this thing for MSNBC about how a lot of young people have normalized Trump. When I was on Stephanie Ruhle, she mentioned the idea that don't they get that this guy is just like a hustler, a hustle. And all I can think it touches on what you're saying, which is, yeah, but a lot of them are like, they hustle all the time. The hustle is part of life. And like online, getting famous online requires a little bit of that hustle, right? You've got to kind of sell. Like you said, you've got to sell out. Why wouldn't you sell out? Like selling out is how you get places, right? You tweak and you give people what they want. And then when you finally get big enough, yeah, man, you do the ads. And like, that's how you do it. Because, right, like anybody who gets famous, not in the way that, again, Jennifer Aniston or Tom Cruise gets famous, has to also get famous and then like do ads for like Blue Apron, right? That's what everybody has to do, right? You have to like do things like that. So I think that you're right. And that's even something that's like, I don't know, my generation is like, I'm millennial. I think we're just, I don't know what our stereotype is. I guess we're very sincere. It's like sincerity is our thing. I don't know. The younger generations seem to despise our sincerity. So I do think it's kind of, there's a sense of that same level of ironic detachment, perhaps that Gen X has, but cutting in a different direction where, actually, yeah, look, selling out's just the game. That's how you do it. And, what do I care if I'm selling out? It got me, 20K more followers, and it got me a new sponsorship.
Dragging this back to the political context, then, is the story of how he got Trump, if it's not eggs, then something like there are people out there who feel like their relative status, either individually or in their group identity, this is like, we could say this is a kind of its identity politics all the way down story, have declined. And we have the example of like the deplorables statement that Hillary Clinton made, which was read as, this is, we're going to lower the status of this whole group of people who support this guy. That essentially Trump is seen as two things. One is like an avatar of their group identity. He talks like me. He's brash like me. He has the same kind of cultural preferences as I do. Whether that's authentic or not doesn't really matter, because even if he's playing a role, he's playing the role of someone I see as like me versus, say, a Barack Obama, who's someone like them. And so by elevating his status, it's elevating my group status. And then also because this is relative, because status is relative, the other thing that Trump does is he beats up and punishes the people who aren't like me. He's going to hurt them. He's going to take away their stuff. He's going to kick them out of the country. He's going to banish their pronouns from public life and so on. And that is going to just naturally by lowering their status, raise mine. But if that's the story, and this is, I think this kind of ties into like, where do we go from here? That's a very different way of governing than at least presidents have like spoken to and nominally approached it. It's not I'm going to reach across the aisle. We're going to do what's good for all Americans. I'm going to improve. It is more just like, I'm going to be the avatar of your identity and beat up the people you don't like. And I can see the appeal for people, but what do we as like liberals, who our entire worldview is essentially like, that's not how you run things. How should we think about that? And how should we think about essentially selling out in that? Like we want to be popular with our ideas, right? We want to like, but it seems like if you're right about this, the political appetite is for something very different than what we're selling.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, this is where I get like really glad that I like do a small like nonpartisan think tank that's supposed to talk about liberalism, and that my job isn't to win an election in 2026 or 2028, because I mean, yeah, man, liberals are much maligned all the time, I think. But particularly right now, we are not liked. And we want to be liked. Also because I think the liberal position is that we like everybody else, so we just can't understand why no one likes us. But, you know, so there's, I think, a few avenues to chase there. One is absolutely status anxiety being relative 100% to me means that there are people for whom the point of Trump is to simultaneously lift them up and to hurt other people and push them down. There's no question to me about that. And you see that across the board, right? And this is why it's interesting. It can work with people who already pretty much have a lot going for them in society. You know, again, we mentioned like white Christians who are pretty privileged already. They're not really in a, you know, lower position, to immigrants who feel perhaps animosity towards newer arrivals or towards current undocumented arrivals because they don't like seeing them receive state support. They don't like seeing these pathways be created for those people to become citizens because they, you know, their path to where they are now, where maybe they have, you know, permanent residency or citizenship took a couple decades, and there's a resentment there. And that absolutely is a status question, also a question of assimilation, right? Because you might be proud of your home, the nation of origin and your culture, but you're also proud to have become an American. And maybe you feel now that part of that is to guard and gatekeep that process of becoming American from other people, right? So it's interesting because it can cut from very well-off privileged groups who might just feel that, you know, the tiny little bit of gains by minorities, et cetera, are damaging to them. And what we might not consider very well-off groups at all, who still see that relative competition, right, from where they're at, and see positioning themselves with MAGA politics as a way to secure status. And I think it's a lie, right? That's the other trick for this, is I think it's a lie, right? Because I think with liberalism, you're offering people, to me, an off-ramp from that. In theory, you're saying, actually, if you really believe in pluralism and mutual toleration, then there's a baseline of status that everyone should be accorded in society, right? You may not be the wealthiest person, right? Liberals accept a certain degree of competition and inequality, but we also tend to think that people play within the sort of like 20-yard lines of things. And I think that should be attractive. Aren't people tired of this? Because I find it exhausting. I do. And I wonder if that's a thing. You know, we have to speak to people's experiences and their emotions. And one of the things I think you could say is that authoritarianism, status anxiety, these kinds of highly fractious politics, aren't they exhausting? Aren't they so exhausting? I actually think in 2020, one of the best arguments that got made isn't Trump mismanaging COVID. Isn't this exhausting? aren't you tired? Aren't you sick of it? And I think that actually does resonate with people, because the scary version of this, right, is that the last time we had leaders in the United States raising things to this level of group status anxiety competition, which, we can basically just call factionalism, was the decade leading to the Civil War, right? That's what we had and at that time it had much more to do with sectional, North-South status, but it was still there, free state, slave state status. You can't play this game for very long without potentially raising tensions to a catastrophic place. So, but that is less persuasive to the everyday person because it's hard to contemplate catastrophe. It's much easier to get them to reflect on how exhausting it feels at the end of every day to think about this stuff and feel this way.
It also speaks to, I think there's a question of, to bring up the selling out metaphor again, there's a question of authenticity around all of this in two ways. The first is, so you mentioned the war on Christmas, and the issue with the war on Christmas is like there never was a war on Christmas, and stores are still overflowing earlier every year with Christmas stuff, and we still make Christmas movies and argue about what counts as a Christmas movie, and it is very much at the center of American culture, but a lot of people exist in media bubbles and environments that are telling them otherwise. And so it's not, so yes, you're right that I think you're very right that if people feel like their identity is no longer as dominant as it used to be because other identities are getting attention now, that can feel like a loss of status, even if it's not like a loss of absolute status. But the fact that they feel that way does not necessarily indicate that it is true that their identity is less centered than it used to be. They could be being told by people. I had the experience several years ago for another podcast, I had to watch the God's Not Dead movies, Kevin Sorbo. And that was my first exposure to that genre of filmmaking, to evangelical Christian filmmaking, because I'm not Christian, I'm not evangelical, I'm not in that culture, I don't watch that stuff. And the thing that struck me was how much those movies were portraying white Christian evangelicals as just an incredibly oppressed minority, when they're just simply not even remotely, right? So there is that aspect of it, of how do we, if part of the status anxiety is essentially for lack of a better term, false consciousness, like they're being told that their status is lowering when in fact it isn't. They're being told other statuses are much higher than they actually are. How do we handle that? And then the related is a lot of how people respond to feeling low status actually, even if it was a false low status, makes authentic their low status. So I'm thinking of my 15-year-old daughter was talking with me about the incels and these boys who behave are watching Andrew Tate and reading pickup artist stuff, and that these boys are convinced that they can't find a girlfriend, they're low status, this is the way out of it. But the point that she made is actually the reason they can't find a girlfriend is because of the stuff they're doing to fix their low status, right? It's if they just stopped being these weirdos and doing this stuff, they'd get a girlfriend. So it's not that they're unattractive or stupid or other things. It's that they're being sold a false way out of their perceived low status, and that false way out is in fact lowering their status. And so this was a very long and kind of meandering, but I guess the core of it is I am worried that if status anxiety is what's driving a lot of this, a lot of that status anxiety is both not authentic because it doesn't map onto the actual state of the world, but is instead being sold to people. And the reaction of the people who are feeling status anxiety is actually having the effect of making them lower status, which then just feeds back in.
The through line here to me is connection. And the more sophisticated term is to talk about social capital. And there's a reason I framed this piece initially with social capital, which is our retreat from society. Civic society, right? This is the Putnam thesis. Our retreat from groups and, city government and bowling clubs and book clubs and things that bind us together. And I think today in the 2020s, our retreat really just from things in general, right? Derek Thompson has this excellent essay at The Atlantic right now about loneliness. You cannot separate that from this crisis of status anxiety because the fix is to be around other people. To be engaged, to feel the trick to feeling like you matter is to do stuff that actually provides that feeling legitimately, right? Get involved, be in a group, do things with people, know your neighbors. The reason the artificiality of these arguments works is because we don't actually, a lot of us have a legitimate thing to stand it up against because we don't know these people that we're being told threaten our status anxiety because we don't really go out of our front door and talk to anyone. We retreat to our phones, which just make it worse, right? Because we're on our screens, we're seeing people that make us mad. We're also seeing people that have stuff that maybe we even like, but we envy them and we wish we were more like them and we wish we had what they had. And so, the through line is that, right? Even those boys, right? That's what they're basically saying is, if I had connection, I wouldn't feel this way. Well, and then of course it gets worse, right? Because it's an illness, right? It's a malady. So rather than enabling us to do the things we need to do to get out and do it, we draw further and further inward, right? We're not like, again, the fix would be to get out. The fix would be to join a club. The fix would be to get involved in your local, library or it doesn't have to be government. It can be government, but it just needs to be other people and community and civic life and, neighbors. And yet, the more we retreat, the more susceptible we are to the most pernicious aspects of these lies. And they're not just lies that are being told to us. They're lies that we tell ourselves in our own head, right? When we scroll through media and when we engage with this stuff. And then the worse we feel, the more under siege we feel, the more we retreat because we don't want to know those people. So it just compounds. And so to me, now the actual, how you get that to people to do it, that's maybe tougher. But I think the through line there and the actual sort of what's wrong is like a big blaring klaxon saying, social capital, connection, community.
Yeah, the what to do about it is, because we see calls. Jonathan Haidt wrote a whole book about it that's essentially abolish social media. Don't let kids use this stuff. And for one, I'm skeptical of a lot of the data that gets used to support those claims. But also, we tend to downplay that yes, if we live in your phone, it means you're not connecting with people in the world around you. And that can be bad in all the ways that you just described. But also, if you are like the gay kid in your small rural town, and so the world outside your door is a lot of people your age who want to beat you up or don't understand you, and online lets you find like your people. That's incredibly powerful, and that kind of stuff happens all the time, and we don't want to take that away.
So I should cut back. This makes me think back to the thing you said earlier. I did grow up, right? I grew up in the South. I grew up in a smallish town. I went to a private Christian liberal arts college. So I grew up deep in this stuff. And the besieged mentality, it's there. And that's actually, I'm not going to say that the actual experiences of those people are the same as the gay kid in another place. But they feel under siege. A lot of them, they think the world hates them. Now, they don't all think that, but a lot of them do. They believe that line, that the world hates you. There's a lot of talk within evangelical Protestantism that the world hates you, right? The world is against you. And they might like you, but they wouldn't like you if you talked about Jesus, right? Which is not all that different than saying, they won't like you if you're gay. Now, again, I'm not comparing the actual aspects of those things, but the talk is there. And here's what I would say. I totally love that the internet can provide community. But one of the things it's cultivated is that my community is only the people who are like me and agree with me. And one of the things that Putnam's thesis is about is that your community, there are people who are right out the door. And the people right out the door are a vast array of types of people. And some of them are a lot like you. Some of them like the things you like. Some of them believe the things you believe. Some of them have the God you have. But they don't all. And if we lose our capacity to think of people who are different from us as part of our community, this all gets a lot worse.
Yeah, and there are structural features of our online world, I think, that speak to that as well. One of the things that older generations notice about younger generations and has been discussed at length is they tend to very quickly turn to authority figures to mediate disputes in a way that, so you're feuding with a friend, you run to an adult. Someone does something you don't like, you run to an adult. In our online spaces, you either just hit the block button, or you run to the moderators of the platform and say, this kind of thing should not be allowed here. And content moderation matters a lot. Unmoderated spaces online are terrible. I don't want to discount all of that, but there's this nexus of, we kind of have this dispute, and the way you settle it isn't to first make an attempt at a kind of natural social solution of figuring it out or putting up with it or recognizing what matters and what doesn't, but is to go and say, this person who has a degree of power can fix it for us. And I think the result of that is it potentially reinforces a lot of the features that you have just talked about, of you essentially have grouped the world into the people who entirely agree with me and then the people I'm mad at. And there isn't that broad spectrum of just call them kind of likable but generally irritating people in between.
Yeah. And social media, obviously, then what we're seeing now is we all just want the place where the moderators are our moderators, right? Where they'll do it the way we want. So that's what's sort of happening, right? Is X is for people who want moderators that don't care if you use slurs, and other platforms are for moderators who might be a lot more quick, right, to suspend an account for something else. And there's a status anxiety thing there too, right? Of I want to be where people like me are given preference, right? That's what I want. I want to be where people like me are. We're free to kind of say what we want, right? I can go and say this person is the devil. But if they use the kind of set of words that my community has agreed are offensive and wrong, and look, a lot of those words are offensive and wrong, then, they'll get the slap, right? And it just cuts different directions. And again, the reason I think one of the fixes is this idea of social capital and civic life is one of the moderators of real life interactions is just, you wouldn't say this stuff to people. There's actual authorities, but there's also just human interaction is moderated by instincts that kick into gear when we're not staring at a screen, right? About not actually wanting to create, massive conflict with a person, right? There's so much stuff you wouldn't say. And I think that matters too, because some of the slights we carry and some of the senses of insult we carry are generated by a particular space of interaction where no one would talk like this. And people will say, well, that's because, people are the most honest on the internet. I don't actually think that. I think the animosity isn't necessarily honesty. I think it's just that it unleashes an instinctual part of us that is not as present when we're in person with each other. And that is bad for us because it leaves us all walking away feeling disrespected and insulted and angry, right? And we carry those. People carry those all the time. They walk around. To circle it kind of back to some of the other stuff we were saying. People walk around all the time being mad about stuff that someone said either about them or about some group they belong to on the internet.
Does this mean that there's a lot of civility talk, and I have always, I confess, I've been a little bit skeptical of civility talk on the grounds that it often, if you pay attention to the way that it's employed, so this is the calls for people to be more civil in their rhetoric and the way they engage with others. It often gets employed as essentially like a tool for status quo bias and a tool to kind of push marginalized voices out of. So these voices have been marginalized. They're not getting a piece in the conversation. The only way to get a piece in the conversation is to essentially be more apparent in it, which requires if the civil ways of engaging have been denied to you, incivility may be the only thing that's left, and it can kind of silence marginalized voices. So this is the why are urban African Americans protesting in the street when they could just be voting to change the criminal justice laws? And it's well, because they've been gerrymandered out, their political power has been sapped. Protesting in the street is the only thing that's left to do. And so I have that skepticism about civility talk, but it sounds but civility matters a lot as well. And it sounds like it's almost one way to think about what you just said is essentially saying be more civil is missing what's going on, which is that we naturally are more civil in high social capital, community connected spaces. That if I'm talking to you, I may say really nasty things about you, Alan, on Blue Sky, but when we get face to face, I'm I can kind of see the effect of my words on you, or otherwise, there are just cues that we pick up by nature of natural human interaction, and that aren't there in the online space. And so that really what a decline in civility is less about us unlearning the habits of civility, and more of our interaction is happening in spaces where our natural civility triggers aren't being triggered.
Absolutely. And this kind of, to me, goes back to what you were saying earlier about people aren't more status seeking than they used to be. I don't think people are more, I don't think human beings are, we haven't evolved to become less civil in the last 40 years, right? What's happening is there are conditions that exacerbate certain aspects of our nature, right? And then there are conditions that are good for other parts, right? And face-to-face interaction and being parts of groups and those things are pretty good for those actual, evolutionarily arrived at psychological needs for connection and prestige and respect. And also, right, we have psychological evidence that when you can look at a person face to face, there's all kinds of actual recognition happening, right, in your brain that does affect how you talk to them. And we have evidence that a person's face on a screen doesn't trigger those same recognition processes. And so you feel dislocated and you feel this capacity for animus because you're in a space that's not designed at all for the parts of you that did evolve to productively engage in community. And so that's a disaster, right, for our interaction. Yeah, it's not about well, you can't be rude to this person because people, but people can be, and look, even pre-cell phone, people had big debates about how fractious you should be when you're pursuing a particular goal, and that was a conversation within different activist groups, etc. But it just changes how we interact with each other. It just does, and so that matters, for civility. But the reason I tried to interweave this stuff with phones and with loneliness versus social capital into the status anxiety argument is that I just think we have to accept a few things, which is that there are interior conditions, right, which is sort of our biology, our psychology, our evolutionary traits that desire prestige and recognition and connection. There are external ones, right? These historical kind of material conditions that have to do with sort of how society is currently structured at any given moment, the technologies we have, and everything else. And, then there's sort of cultural stuff that ebbs and flows in between. And the danger is that I think we're at a moment of true crisis where, our social capital is almost completely depleted. Our institutions that facilitate the building of social capital and the capacity for political community are eroded. And at the same time, we've been given a whole bunch of new tools that just supercharge all the bad instincts within us. They supercharge our sort of tendencies towards enemy and hostility and envy and contempt. And also all of that is part of status anxiety, because we're desperate for recognition and we're not getting it. And we're also not giving it.
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you enjoyed today's episode, please send it to a friend, or take a moment to review the show on Apple Podcasts. And check out my free newsletter at www.aaronrosspowell.com.